I know that Rosh Hashanah may seem far off, but if you are a community leader or someone who has been considering blowing the shofar for your community, there is no time like the present to be thinking about it. I'm excited to share this special episode of Responsa Radio, which will be all about the shofar. We recorded this last year, and I just want to share that I did blow the shofar, and it turned out to be an incredibly moving and spiritual experience for me. The following episode was recorded before we switched to the video recording, so it'll look a little bit different. I hope you enjoy. Hi, and welcome to Responsa Radio, where you ask and we answer questions of Jewish law in modern times. I'm Rabbi Avi Killip, Executive Vice President at Hadar, here with Rabbi Ethan Tucker, Rosh Yeshiva at Hadar, a center for Jewish learning and community building based in New York City. You can check us out and learn more at hadar.org. So usually on this show, I bring a question from a listener for us to discuss. And very rarely, I think only one other time ever, I bring my own question. And that's what I want to do today, actually.
Host prerogative.
Yeah, I actually started from a very genuine place of I sent you a text message and said, hey, I'd love to have this conversation with you. And then thought, you know what? Why don't we record it and make this an episode of Responsa Radio? The question that prompted me to send you that text is that I have agreed to blow the shofar this year for my community on Rosh Hashanah, really as the shofar blower. You know, I've blown the shofar one other time on Rosh Hashanah, but it was many years back.
Yeah.
And since then, I've blown the shofar in shul during the month of Elul. I blow it every morning at home with my children. But it feels to me like a really significant thing to be the person taking on this mitzvah for my community. And so I wanted to ask you for some tips, for some advice on how I might be thinking about this from a halachic standpoint. So first of all, maybe you'll point me to some sources that I should dig into and study in advance more deeply. But also was hoping you would give me maybe top 5 halachic tips for people blowing the shofar in shul on the high holidays.
Yeah. Well, on this one, I actually think opening the Shulchan Aruch and looking at the Mishnah Berurah or the Aruch HaShulchan and some of the commentators there is a pretty good place to go. And for anyone who's going to be deep into this mitzvah, it's worth really learning that material, knowing that material. There's some detail there, but it's not overly complex. But happy for you and for our listeners to give a little bit of the Cliff's Notes of that and a sense of, where you should come at it from. The first thing is just sort of making sure you're in a place where people are going to hear it and people are going to hear it directly and they're going to hear it directly from you. Early sources talk about not blowing a shofar into an underground cellar or a cave or some place where people are going to hear the echo in some kind of way. So most of the time, I assume you'll be in a room with the people who are listening. Some of our listeners, you might be in a place where maybe there's an active microphone nearby. You want to make sure you're not ever having people hear the shofar through a microphone or any other amplification of that sort. So that's number one, just sort of make sure people hear you and hear you directly and not an echo or any other piece.
Yeah. I sort of want to say luckily it's loud.
Yeah.
But also there is something so powerful about hearing the shofar directly. That description you're offering of it draws people in and they should have access to it directly.
Yeah, absolutely. Number 2 is just actually understanding the structure of what shofar blowing is. I think particularly as a kid, but even for people who are adults, are just there's so many times and notes and it just seems like a big mess. But just to remind people what the structure is, the core mitzvah of shofar on Rosh Hashanah is to hear 3 truot. We'll get to defining that later, but the word truah appears 3 times in the Torah in the context of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And that's how our tradition understands that what you need is 3 times of hearing that sound. And other verses point us to the idea that a truah always gets framed before and after by a tkiyah. So a tkiyah is a kind of pure sound that is just a long blast. And a truah, which we'll define as we go forward, is something that's more broken up. All right? So you need a plain blast, a broken blast, a plain blast, and do that 3 times. 3 truot surrounded by 3 tkiyot. And then
3 sets of 3.
3 sets of 3. And then there end up being 2 versions of doing that, which we kind of do both of. One, blowing those sets on their own before we're in any kind of prayer mode. So this is the set that happens right after we read the Haftorah and as we're getting ready to put the Sefer Torah away on the morning of Rosh Hashanah. And then another tradition that intersperses those in the middle of the Amidah. And we do it as part of prayer. So you can see we're starting to add up already to more and more places, but each of them have that core structure, 3 truot, 2 tkiyot on either side. The problem is there's some argument, lack of clarity or multivocality that emerges over the years. What's a truah?
Yeah.
Is a truah more like a wailing sound of someone moaning? That's what we end up calling the shvarim. Is the truah more of kind of like a piercing, almost military call, what we call the truah? Or is it both of those put together? Shvarim truah. So what you end up, these 3 sets end up being 3 sets of 3, where basically you do each of those combinations. So tkiya, shvarim truah, tkiya 3 times, tkiya, shvarim, tkiya 3 times, and then tkiya, teruah, tkiya 3 times. And do all of those as a package once before the Amidah of Musaf and once during.
So the numbers end up getting really pretty high here.
Yeah, you're up to like 60 blasts by that point if you're counting, shvarim truahs 2 when you put them together. So that already gets to be a lot higher. And then some people, and it differs depending on communities, they're like, well, once we're up to 60, let's take it to 100.
Yeah.
And then they'll add 30 at the end and another 10. Some folks will do it all as 40 altogether. Others split them up. But the core is those 30 before the Amidah and 30 in the Amidah.
This is less practical how-to, but I'm curious if you have a sense of why? We so often have disagreements about how to do something. Why is it that we're choosing to do all the things?
Yeah, I mean, with this one, it kind of feels like they just really want to do it. There's some, I don't know if it's quite how you describe it rhapsodically, but, this notion of, great, more shofar blowing. There's a little bit of a tension in that, actually, traditionally, well, you're not supposed to play a musical instrument on Yom Tov. And so you normally wouldn't, like on Shabbat or on the day of Shavuot, pick up a horn and blow it.
Right.
So there's a little bit of a tension of, well, you should blow the shofar for Rosh Hashanah, but then you shouldn't just sit around all afternoon, right, playing on it. So some communities that will not do the added blasts, or they'll say, no, I do the amount I have to do, and no more than that. But yeah, the doubling feature of before the Amidah, during the Amidah, I mean, truth be told, that's a thing that happens in a lot of liturgical places. If you think about it, at the end of Shabbat.
That's how services got so long.
They get so long with a lot of these things. Like, how does Shabbat end? How do we make Havdalah? Well, we do it over a cup of wine, and we also do it in prayer over the Amidah.
Yeah.
So there's a bunch of rituals like that get doubled, and shofar is one of them too.
And in terms of not playing the instrument on Chag, should I avoid practicing beforehand?
Yeah, so practicing is okay. You're allowed to practice in order to make sure you will do the mitzvah better. But once you're done, you're basically supposed to put the shofar down and not blow it anymore. Meaning when you get home, kids, you don't worry about them if they keep playing with it and blowing it. But adults who are done with their obligation are finished. Though sometimes, there have been many years where I'm the shofar blower, and then in the afternoon, someone who hasn't heard it needs to hear it again, or needs to hear it for the first time. And then even though I'm done, I'm allowed to blow it for them. So it should be focused on fulfilling the mitzvah for yourself or for others.
Yeah. Okay. I think we're up to number 3. What else do we need to think about?
Yeah, let's define the notes now and their duration and their structure. And it's a little tricky, and you're going to want to pay attention to do this in the best and most ideal way. Shivarim, that's the broken sort of more moaning sound, okay? I'll just give us a demonstration of that. So you hear sort of slightly drawn out blasts, 3 separate things. They should all be done with one breath, right? You don't like inhale between them. You take a breath and then you blow those 3 sections of shvarim. And they should each last about as long as it would take to blow 3 really short pulses, right? So like, doo-doo-doo, right? It should be long enough to cover that. That is to say, doo. It's got to have a little bit of duration to it, a little under a second each. It's not very long, but it's longer than a pulse, right? It's 3 times longer than a little pulse.
Right. It's a longer thing that's been broken.
That's right. So that's the shivarim. A teruah is at least 9 pulses. You can add on more.
At least 9.
At least 9.
Oh, I've never heard that.
Yeah, should be at least 9. You can add on more.
How long can I go?
Yeah, you shouldn't add too many, but you got to make sure you have 9. And those shouldn't be drawn out, right? In other words, because otherwise they start to sound like a shivarim.
Right.
So they should sound something like this. Right? Like that. As opposed to the shvarim is, it's got that longer cadence. All right? So 9 pulses, if I were to do it precisely 9, that actually was 10. I stuck in a 10th there, right? You got to listen for it, but it gives you a sense. All right, so that's teruah. Now, those are actually pretty simple. Make sure to keep the teruot short, at least 9 pulses. The shvarim should be 3, and each one should be like 3 pulses long. Tekiyot are more complicated. They're variable. Tekiyot have to be as long as the notes that they frame. So, for instance, a teruah, we said, is 9 short pulses, okay? If you time that out, it comes out to like 1.5 seconds or something like that, which means that the tkiyah surrounding a teruah should be 1.5 to 2 seconds long to make sure it's that long, all right? So let me give you a sense of what that set would sound like. Okay, not so long enough to cover what's in the middle. Tkiyah surrounding shvarim has to be as long as the shvarim. We already said each shever, each small broken note, is supposed to be about 3 pulses long because it's just supposed to be like the teruah, the same length. There's 3 of those shvarim. They're each 3 pulses. That makes the equivalent of 9 pulses, which is the same as the teruah. And the tkiyah then is the same length before and after a shvarim as it would be before and after a teruah. So that would sound like this.
Yeah, what does that sound like?
Okay, that's more or less the cadence it should be. However, when you have a tkiyah, shvarim, teruah, tkiyah, so you have to remember that shvarim teruah is actually kind of one long note, hybridized of the wailing and the trumpety kind of sound. So the tkiyah is supposed to cover both of those, which means it should be over 3 seconds, maybe more like 4 seconds long, to cover the length of what's in the middle.
So the tkiyah will actually be longer in these cases.
Yes, it should. It really must be longer. Some flexibility after the fact if you don't go so long as you should. But if you're planning to blow shofar, you should be practicing that this set is longer. And I will give a heads up, it requires a little more breath and stamina. Like there's just a little more that you're putting into it. So you're going to want it to sound more like this. You hear how that's a lot longer.
It should be actually twice as long.
Yeah, it's twice as long as the other ones. All right, so it will be counterintuitive on some level to think through that if you've been blowing shorter blasts. The good thing is Shvarim Teruah comes first in the order always. So you're kind of pumping yourself up right at the beginning with those long blasts. One thing I will give as a tip is you do have to be careful, though, when you're scaling down to those later sets where you can cut it in half. You can cut it in half, but don't cut it in three, right? You don't want it to be too short. I'll give you an example of what's not right, okay, where the tekiah is too short. And tell me if you hear what happened here.
Yeah, where it became the length of one third.
Exactly. So even the short tekiah still has to be something like this.
Yeah, do you say the word in your head when you do it? I end up doing that.
Yeah, I usually don't. What I end up doing is actually counting pulses in my head from too many times of thinking about this. So anyway, that's point number 3 is get your definitions all straight, what these notes are, and recognize that tekiah has a definition which is variable based on the notes it's surrounding.
And just for anyone who finds themselves as the person calling, who would be listening for a mistake and maybe sending the shofar blower back for a mistake, is getting the length wrong the kind of mistake that you would redo it?
Yeah, you would. There's some degree of latitude in the tekiyot if they are still long enough for a shorter note, but they're not the ideal full length. There you'll get a little bit of question of when do you send people back.
It's a little subjective.
But for instance, if a tekiah is shorter than even the shortest notes, like the tekiah is less than 9 pulses, you got to send back for that. That's just they didn't sound the note.
Yeah.
Right? It's not long enough.
And sometimes that happens because the person wasn't counting, but sometimes you don't get the sound out. You can't always guarantee. Even the best people at blowing the shofar still sometimes
Yeah, I
miss a
consider
note.
myself a pretty good shofar blower. And 2 years ago when I was asked to do it, I just did a horrible job. I don't know why that was. I felt awful about it afterwards. And whatever, it's okay to feel a little bad sometimes.
But then you repented on Yom Kippur, so it was okay.
Yeah, it was more like I felt I left people down. You know, they'd asked me to do this. And that's part of it. It's a big spiritual responsibility, but it's also a technical responsibility.
Right. Right. It's an interesting one because it doesn't feel like leading or like giving a sermon where you can sort of practice and then know you're ready.
Yeah.
Sometimes you don't know what's going to come out.
Yeah. I think the most important thing, this would be my 4th point, is you asked, what do you have to send people back for? So sure, that's a little bit more detailed guidance for the person calling the blasts to know what exactly is valid or invalid. But for a shofar blower, what you need to know is just be on guard. You may be asked to do something you already did again. And you may not know why, and it may not make sense to you. And your job at that moment is not to say, what do you mean? Like,
it was fine.
I did it perfectly fine. No, you just listen. You follow orders. If they tell you to do a tekiah again, you do a tekiah again. If you make a mistake, you will often be told to go back to the previous tekiah to redo the whole set. But that too depends. Different configurations of notes trigger different kinds of responses depending on the mistake.
So for our listeners, if you're the person calling, that actually might be in some ways a job that requires more learning in advance than the person blowing.
That's right. The person blowing shofar, really what they have to be expert at is the physical ability to be able to make the sounds, the clarity on what each of the sounds are and their form and their duration, and the ability to respond with agility when told to do something that's not exactly what they were expecting was going to happen. I'll say one last thing, which is maybe a bummer, but maybe also elevating as an experience. We have to remember that actually the shofar blowing, the way we do it, is one long act that kind of spans throughout the end of the service on Rosh Hashanah. So we read the Haftorah and we're getting ready to put the Torah away. And that's when we take out the shofar for the first time. And that's when you would say the bracha, the blessing over blowing the shofar. But that blessing is meant to cover not just the blasts right then, but the blasts in the Amidah all the way through to the end.
And the person blowing the shofar is the one who says that blessing.
That's right. And there's two things I just want to flag about that. The first is you have to have intention when you say the blessing over the first blast to cover everything later on. But it also means there's a kind of responsibility to have some unified, uninterrupted focus throughout the whole process. It's an unusual thing where you say a bracha and then you immediately start doing the mitzvah, but the mitzvah continues kind of over the course of a couple hours.
Yeah.
There might be a sermon in there. There's a whole Amidah that you're davening. It almost makes me think of like when you're, searching for chametz in your house the night before Pesach, and you say that blessing at the beginning, and then you find the first piece of bread, but then there's like 9 other pieces of bread you got to find. So everyone, truth be told, who's fulfilling the mitzvah is supposed to have that kind of continuity of intent. But the person blowing shofar in particular, you can't actually like go out and chit-chat with someone about completely unrelated matters if you're holding that uninterrupted ritual space and frame for the community.
So this may sound like a very highly specific follow-up question for me, but I'll ask it because actually I think probably in many communities this is the same person. You said you might be listening to a sermon in the middle there, but if I might be giving that sermon, is it important for me to try to say actually I should be giving the sermon at some point in the day before the shofar service begins? I imagine actually that may come up in many communities where the same person giving the sermon is the person blowing the shofar. Does that matter?
Yeah, well, I will say traditionally it does make more sense, and in a lot of places it is held to that the sermon on Rosh Hashanah will be before shofar blowing. That makes a lot of aesthetic sense, particularly if some of the themes of shofar blowing are going to come up in the sermon. But it also makes sense not to introduce unnecessary speaking and digression in that unit. So I would recommend this to anyone. You're just picking where that sermon is going to go. Put it before shofar blowing and not later, even though you might normally do it when the Torah has been put back in the ark or something like that. But that said, even if that happens, the sermon is on theme. It's about what's the themes of the day. It's more like the idle chatter in the hallway, which is fine. It's a part of shul. It's a part of the experience.
Just something to be mindful of.
Yeah. And of course, the basic obligation of any shofar blower is to have in mind, have the intention that they are intending to fulfill this mitzvah for anyone who is in the intended audience, right? And quite frankly, for anyone who might hear it, for years I led services in a tent outside way before COVID. And I never know actually who was walking by might hear the shofar. Maybe that was the only thing they would hear. In some Mishnah and Megillah, it says, as long as the person blowing the shofar has the intention to fulfill the obligation of anyone who comes by, then like an anonymous stranger who passes by who they don't know but hears them is able to ride on their coattails.
This is not my situation, but for communities where the person blowing the shofar might change from one section to the next, either planned in advance or for some unforeseen reason, somebody else steps up. Do they need to say a new blessing or no?
Yeah, so there's two things that can happen here. Ideally, if that is split up, which again, it's not usually the traditional way of doing it, we say someone who begins a mitzvah, let them finish it. So in general, it's traditional to have one shofar blower, but if it's been divided up, the other person, the person blowing shofar later, should ideally just be sure to be present when the first blasts are blown.
So they can say
Listen, say amen, and be covered by that. If for some reason that didn't happen, well, then that person should privately say the blessing to themselves before actually going up and blowing it.
Yeah.
You wouldn't want to interrupt the flow of the service for that because it would actually just be covering them. Everyone in the room had their blessing fulfilled, right? Or that piece fulfilled by the first shofar blower. And I find the kids coming up and inviting people to kind of draw in close can be very powerful and very meaningful, not to just treat it as any other moment in the service. And getting that rhythm going, like particularly when it would be like kids would come back in at the end of every bracha in the Amida where you were blowing it. I would say, for someone who's blowing shofar, it's a special experience if you're able to do it, to both be very focused on the technical pieces of it, while also trying to get a little bit lost in it. You really are trying to elevate yourself in the community to another plane. We use this verse, Allah Elohim bitrua Adonai bekol shofar. Literally, God ascends in the sound of the shofar. And to me, that's always an image I lock onto, like these sounds that are going up, depending on how your shofar is pointed and oriented. It may literally be pointing up. It's the closest we get in some ways to feeling like our spirit is actually ascending. And I think if you as a shofar blower and the kahal as the community listening can lean into that, that to me is very strong.
This year in particular, the image of the shofar as being tied to the cries of mothers. We have in our tradition the cries of Sarah and the cries of Sisera's, Sisera, the mother of Sisera, the cries of our mother of our enemy, so to speak, being tied up in this sound, feel especially poignant to me, actually, as a mother, to be blowing shofar. It's still a little bit rare sometimes for women to be blowing shofar, and it feels very powerful, actually, to be the one bringing this sound to the community. Okay, one last question. You didn't give me a time guideline for Tekiah Gedolah. That one feels like we shouldn't skip it.
Yeah. Tekiah Gedolah has to minimally be as long as the note it's surrounding, which is always in the way we do it, a teruah, which is pretty short. Mm-hmm. So sort of the sky's the limit.
It shouldn't be shorter than a regular Tekiah.
That's right, which obviously it's a Tekiah Gedolah, so it's obviously longer. There's no guideline on it. It's not really a formal requirement. It is a shtick almost.
Just for funsies?
It's a sense of, somewhere between fun and letting out the last of all of your breath, not leaving anything on the field in terms of doing this mitzvah. So I think my only guidance on that, I'm a kind of stickler for, dignity in shul. And so I think sometimes a Tekiah Gedolah that goes on so long that then the shofar blower makes a kind of like exasperated breath, or people start laughing, or it becomes like a spectacle. I think that's a little longer. That's taking us to places we don't quite want to be. You want to use your judgment.
You want to end strong.
Yeah, a length that feels like, wow. Right, that gives you a sense of something profound just happened here. That's what you're going for. And there's a certain level at which you go long enough and people may start to open their eyes and roll their eyes at other people. And, it's fine. It's okay. It's part of the glory and also the enjoyment of the day for a lot of people to think about, oh my God, that was such an incredible Tekiah Gedolah. But yeah, I think the shofar blower wants to hold that sense of majesty and dignity.
Yeah, to me, I think that's the section, like that's the moment where you can really get lost in it.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like when you're done getting lost, you should probably stop.
That's right. I think that's a good guideline.
Thank you for this. I appreciate it. I hope that this was a useful and enjoyable episode for our listeners, whether you are a person who has blown the shofar every year for as long as you can remember, and this is just either a refresher or just a moment to delight in a mitzvah that you really love, or whether this is a mitzvah you're considering taking on. You've never blown a shofar. It sounds intriguing. It's something you think you could want to do in life. Then I would encourage you, find a teacher. I think sometimes there's a lot of mystery that makes people feel intimidated to take on this mitzvah, and you might find that actually you're pretty good at it, and it's worth learning both about the mitzvah and also how to blow a shofar. And lastly, for those who you've never blown a shofar and you have no intention to, I hope this is an episode that will actually help you just be a more knowledgeable and attentive listener to these blasts, to appreciate the nuance and the craft of this mitzvah this coming year in shul. Shana Tova.
Tekiah Gedolah.
With a big band before I was born. The timbre of his trumpet, it made the rafters ring. But the crowd began to cheer when she started to sing. The people said, they all agreed, she became the music and she sure could wear.
Thank you for joining us for this season of Responsa Radio. Over the course of this season, we've tackled some important, meaningful, and also some lighthearted questions. We're going to take a break until the fall. We can't wait for you to hear our next season. Have a halachic question you'd like answered on the show? Email us at responsa@hadar.org. Responsa Radio is a project of the Hadar Institute. Thanks to Chana Kupetz and Jeremy Tabick for producing this podcast, and to David Khabinsky for recording and editing this episode.